Welcome to Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell. This is the place where we dive into the world of talent acquisition, explore the challenges of today's workplace, and discover what it takes to build a thriving and successful organization.
My guest today is best-selling author, acclaimed speaker, and workplace strategist, Erica Keswin, with her transformative books, Bring Your Human to Work and Rituals Roadmap. Erica has ignited discussions on creating workplaces that benefit both people and business. Her new book, The Retention Revolution, promises fresh insights into keeping employees connected in our evolving work landscape. She's a true pioneer in reshaping the future of work and human connection. Erica, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. So great to see you.
It's great to have you. I'm intrigued by how you got here. What has inspired you to become a workplace strategist and author, focusing on the intersection of work and the human connection?
You know, it's funny when I think about that question, you don't go to, maybe now these days, but back in the day, you don't go to college saying, "Ooh, I'm going to become a workplace strategist," or major in that. So my dad was
maybe you can now. I don't know though.
Yeah, maybe you can now. My dad was a lawyer. My mom was a teacher. I didn't even know a thing about business. So, I thought I was going to go to law school. I loved school, and it seemed to be an easy approach. And I ended up meeting somebody just socially who worked in consulting, and ended up getting into consulting and loved it, but found that a lot of the work I was doing, this will date me, but back in 1995, 93, was sort of in the re-engineering days. And I felt like a lot of what I was doing ended up in a binder on a shelf, and thought, you know what, I love this consulting thing, but I would love to consult in a way on a topic that I feel like makes more of a difference. And I had a friend working at William Mercer at the time. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, oh, it's human resources consulting. So did some research, talked to a lot of people, and ended up going back to business school at Kellogg and Northwestern, focusing on organizational behavior. So my background is this blend of business and psychology. And the moment that shaped my, getting into the book writing and the human workplace work was sort of two events, 10 years apart. The first was in 1998, I was engaged, and my now husband, then fiance, said, hey, I was working at Russell Reynolds at the time doing executive recruiting heads of HR globally. He said, hey, I have this conference to go to in Bermuda. Do you want to come? And I didn't have any vacation days because I was saving them for our honeymoon. And I said, but oh my gosh, I have this new handy dandy square thing called the BlackBerry, and I can actually go to Bermuda and work from the beach, which was just novel in 1998. And I remember saying out loud to myself, this is the life. Like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. Like, oh my gosh. Fast forward 10 years and 3 kids later, it's funny, we're recording this today from Aspen, and we had actually taken a family sabbatical. We put our kids in school in Colorado for a little family adventure. It's 10 years later, the iPhone had just come out. I now find myself walking around with a BlackBerry, because I love that phone, and an iPhone, with 3 kids telling me to get off the phone. And in contrast to that moment in Bermuda, I truly remember saying to myself out loud, I can't believe this is my life. And I've always been a connector. And I was beginning to see the impact of technology on sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and of how it was impacting connection. And so I merged those two worlds and really started to look at, the impact of technology on connection at work. And that led me to Bring Your Human to Work, which led me to book 2 and now book 3.
So throughout your journey, as you've been consulting and writing, how has the landscape of workplace dynamics evolved since you started your career, and what trends do you kind of see happening, coming in the future years?
It's funny, so much have changed, but as much as things change, they stay the same in a certain way. And this idea of relationships matter. I mean, when you think back to one of the most well-known longitudinal studies out of Harvard that studied, actually was men over a 75 to probably now 80-year period, what they found was the thing that matters, that most closely aligns at the end of your life to wellness and happiness and just overall satisfaction, is the depth of your relationships. When I wrote Bring Your Human to Work, and this idea of bringing your human to work, and people say to me, well, what does that mean? It's about honoring relationships and honoring relationships with your colleagues, with your boss, with your direct report, with your customers and clients, and also that relationship with yourself. That was 5 years ago. And, we've been through a global pandemic and many, many other things. And here we are now, 5 years later, in the retention revolution, which I almost think is in certain ways bring your human to work too. That's not as sexy of a title, but it's the idea of we're in this generative AI and, is technology taking over all of our jobs? And my position doesn't change, even from back in 1998 through today, that, we need to find the sweet spot between tech and connect. Let's leverage it for all of its greatness. And it's awesome. I mean, look, we're doing this on great technology today. We're looking at each other. We're in two different states, but we also need to put that technology in its place and to connect on a human level. So there's a lot of things that I'm sure we'll get into that has changed, especially post-pandemic. Actually, I wouldn't even say change. I saw a lot of these trends 5 years ago. The pandemic accelerated them, which we'll talk about flexibility and professional development, all these things. But I don't know, what changes at the end of the day as humans. I think a lot of it stays the same.
Okay. So you mentioned bring your human to work. You emphasize in that the importance of bringing one's authentic self to the workplace. Can you share maybe a personal experience that helped shape this perspective?
Yeah. So, it's funny. People will say, well, how human? I mean, it's still work. So I sometimes have to qualify that with, bring your human to work. You want to bring your best self to work. Because again, it still is work. There are different industries, there are different norms. I will say, however, that this idea of the human professional not being an oxymoron 5 years later really has changed. So I'm hoping that we get into that. But yeah, this idea of bringing your human to work. One of the things that motivated me to look at this through the technical lens was when I started interviewing leaders for that book. One of the things I found, and this is funny to even think about pre-pandemic, and I think we're back to a little bit of this, not as much, is that I would go into offices and everybody was in the office, but they were calling into conference calls or calling into meetings from down the hall. And this idea, again, like to me, I guess in my, Gen X age, I was like, what is going on here? And I would say to some of the partners at these firms, well, why are some of the younger people calling in from down the hall? And they're like, well, one said they weren't dressed appropriately. One said they had the sniffles. I just remember being in these rooms and, learning organically where, the partner puts the client on mute and explains kind of what's really going on, which you can't do remotely. Like it's this learning and development. So as I was interviewing leaders about the technology and the good and the bad and the ugly, this idea of, well, how do we need to bring our human to work physically, but that's also very differently than being there, mentally, psychologically. And there's a lot that I've written about in terms of, being present and creating these rules of the road, because just because we're all in the same room together doesn't mean we're bringing our human to work. So that's one sort of thread of things that I began, and we're all guilty of it. But when we think about this idea of honoring relationships, and especially now, when we are not seeing each other, we're maybe going to the office a couple days a week, or I literally flew in last night from Microsoft where there's a team there of 250 people and they get together for 1 week, twice a year called Team Week. And, and I said to them, be here this week. You've given yourself this gift and the company is making an investment to be here physically. I'm looking at you, I'm seeing you, but that's very different than at the end of this week. It will be good for you personally and professionally if you've really, brought your human to these moments. Key word there is intentional. This is cheesy, but I've had a podcast for a couple of seasons called Left to Our Own Devices. Left to our own devices, we're not connecting because we forget, we're lazy, whatever it is. We all have a lot going on. We've got to be intentional.
I also like, in addition to that, you talk about your authentic self. When I wrote Fire Your Hiring Habits, we talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion and how if there's a part of you that you feel like you can't bring to work, you can't be your authentic self. You're holding part of you back. You can't bring your whole self to it. So I love that perspective of just being there, all of you being there.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting at this event at Microsoft yesterday, I did a Q&A and somebody asked, and it's the book did just come out, but she said that she loved the fact that in this human professional chapter, I do talk about the changing definition of the human professional and people having tattoos and how Gen Z views showing up as their authentic self and feeling that you're comfortable doing that. And she mentioned, and I was glad that she brought it up. She's like, look, I have a whole part in there on neurodiversity. And she's, look, I have severe ADHD. And like the fact that you're bringing that up. And, that is one of the positives that have come out of not only the pandemic, but also the flexibility in the working from home and the use of technology, that we can be more inclusive as a workplace if we want to.
Yeah, I mentioned to you earlier, I was just returning from Romania where my keynote was, there is a future for the human workforce. And we talked about diversity as part of that. And it really is, it's not just gender diversity. It's not just ethnic diversity. There's neurodiversity, there's diversity of geography, there's diversity of education. There's so many pieces. And the more diverse team and group you can bring together, the better things happen. It's just, you get more creative solutions, you get different perspectives. So big believer in diversity, but it has to go beyond one or two dimensions. So in another of your books, Rituals Roadmap, you explore the significance of rituals in the workplace. So what are some powerful workplace rituals that you've encountered in your research?
Oh my gosh, that's like asking me which child.
Exactly. Pick your favorite child.
My favorite, and I do have 3 children, it depends on the day. So when I was writing that book, the way that I would identify and sort of extract people's rituals was I would say to them, when do you feel, to the leader, when do you feel most Kind Bar-ish, Chipotle-ish, Microsoft-ish, whatever the question, and when do you feel most connected? And that was, asking that question, I would say pretty much 10 times out of 10, enabled them to be like, oh, this is my ritual. And the structure of that book is it's structured around the answers to those questions, really around the employee experience and the employee journey. So I have onboarding rituals. I have rituals in meetings. I have rituals in eatings, eating together. So I'll start with like a general comment, which is a lot of my work in this area is inspired by a study out of Cornell by a guy named Kevin Niffen. And Kevin was studying team performance. What makes one team higher performing than another team? And his dad was a firefighter, and he grew up hanging out with mostly the guys in the firehouse. And what he found, long story short, was that the firefighters who are the most dedicated to the ritual of the firehouse meal, sitting around the table, like to your point, bringing their whole self to work, it actually correlated with higher levels of performance, and those firefighters save more lives. So, I've always been a connector. I call myself a professional dot connector. On the side, I've set up a few marriages, but love sort of connecting the dots and seeing these themes in my books. And that was really this sort of aha goosebump moment for me, saying, wow, something I knew intuitively, here's this data to back it up. So that was sort of the beginning. One of my favorites is I interviewed Daniel Lubetzky, who's the founder of Kind Bar, now the executive chairman. And when I asked him that question, he said, he thinks he feels most connected as a leader, but his associates feel most connected during the onboarding. And they have a ritual where, they do certain things on people's first day and first week, but there's one ritual every quarter where all of the new hires come together. And Daniel still does this, even though he's not even full-time with the company anymore. And he talks about the origin story of Kind. And what he shares is that if it wasn't for the kindness of a stranger, Daniel's father would have died in the Holocaust. And it's this reminder of purpose and why people do every day. Yes, they are selling granola bars and they taste good, but this origin of how this company came about and how we think about kindness as a brand, and all the different things that we do is not only really important for all of us, but when you think about especially Gen Z and then the new generation coming in, the purpose is really key. On the other end of the spectrum, something totally different. I interviewed the co-founders of Allbirds, the cool felt sneaker company, and I said, when do you feel most connected? And they mentioned they have a ritual that was, sometimes rituals, they can come from anywhere, top down, bottom up, inside out, and can be very organic. So this ritual at Allbirds started when one of an employee wasn't feeling great, went to the doctor, it was when it was a startup, probably working too much, and said, you know what, I got to focus on my health. And I am going to do this many push-ups between now and the end of the year. And he took that number and he divided it by the number of days left in the year, and he got to 40. So if he did 40 push-ups a day, he would meet his goal. So he came back to the office and he started doing them in the afternoon at Allbirds, instead of the dark chocolate break or the unhealthy smoke break. Not that he was a smoker, doing push-ups. And the guy next to him joined, and the woman down the hall joined, and then somebody came and didn't do the push-ups but watched the push-ups, and it became this ritual called 40 at 4. And everybody kind of stopped, chit-chatted, and did what they were doing, and really, again, connected. And the funny thing is that in the pandemic, I'd written this book and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to this book? Because everything has changed overnight. And I had time, luckily, to go back and re-interview many of the leaders in the book to see how they were adapting their rituals for the pandemic. And this one stuck. And, people were from home, videotaping their push-ups.
Turning on their video and still watching, doing the push-ups. Yeah.
And it was, rituals give us, in the book, I have this, what is the ROI? And I have this equation called the 3 Ps. One is it gives us a sense of psychological safety and belonging, right? Everyone at Kind Bar has gone through this onboarding ritual, right? Become part of this group. Rituals give out, the second P is rituals connect us to purpose. And you add those two together and you get increased performance, and you think of the firefighter. So I could talk about rituals forever, but those are just a couple.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing those. So let's get into your latest book, The Retention Revolution. First, when was it launched?
September 26th.
September 26th. So can you give us a peek into one surprising way to keep employees connected to their companies?
So the idea behind the book, and this was the general surprise, which was this idea of if you love them, let them leave. That the days of, golden handcuffs and people staying at one company for a long time, which is a trend that we've seen for a while, but even maybe staying at 3 companies your whole career, that the new generations, and it's spreading out to others, they look at their careers differently. And I'm sure you've talked to people, they're looking at it like a portfolio. And gone are I think if we were to speak again in 5 years, I was a recruiter. And when I used to see a resume and somebody's moved all over, it was like red flag, red flag. Now, I think in 5 years, it's like maybe we'll even design our resumes differently, by skills and experience and not just chronologically, because I think people won't necessarily care. So this idea is chances are people are going to leave anyway. And so if we address that elephant in the room early and often and kind of lean into it, even in the onboarding, and say, you know what, chances are, I'd love for you to stay, but chances are, John, you might leave, and, we're kind of dating. Maybe you don't say it like this, but we're dating. We're not necessarily getting married. And that's okay. And here are all the ways while you're here with us. This is how I want to help you develop up, down, and sideways. I want to hear what really drives you, and I'm going to do whatever I can. And if and when you're going to leave, let's stay connected. And work becomes much more of a virtuous cycle. And that really was the overall surprise. And I'm sure, as you've seen in your work, we're seeing a gazillion and one boomerangs. Even Salesforce, just went and they fired all these people, and now they're trying to get them back. So the idea is for anybody listening that has people leaving, what I say is try to take a deep breath, do a little meditation and say, unless somebody is a horrible human, the idea is to stop yourself and say, don't fall into the you're dead to me, don't let the door hit you in the behind. But you know what? Let's stay connected. And so there's a whole chapter in the book about offboarding and all of these different ways to stay connected. So that to me, and I'll add one more thing, which is not in the book, which I wish was in the book, but when you're writing a book, as you know, at some point you got to just call it. There was a really cool study that I found after the fact that looked at all these law firms, and what they found that new lawyers, fresh, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, coming into these law firms the industry found that only 30% of them even had a desire to become a partner. So if on the way in, that was always the goal. I was in consulting. Of course I wanted to be a partner, or a banker. Of course you want to be a managing director. So during the onboarding, if you were to say, well, look to your left and look to your right, a lot of you, that isn't the plan. I mean, that's okay. We have other paths. But my belief is that if you do a lot of the things that are and I can't prove this yet, I hope to someday, 'cause it's only been a week since it's out. But I believe that if you take on a lot of the strategies that are in the book, the byproduct will be retention, because you're giving people what they really want, but it's a byproduct. You're not just doing it to sort of handcuff them, golden handcuff them to the desk.
Yeah, we talk about, in my book, I talk a little bit about celebrating it when they leave, because the exact same reason you talk about, it's like, these can, most likely they're going to stay in your industry. Industries are small. You want good vibes coming back, and you create an environment where, hey, they may go, when I worked at Bose, a lot of people left during some of the various, .com booms, et cetera. So many came back, and they were glad they explored. And, I also talk about another concept, which is, instead of getting a traditional education, a curated education. As you're walking through the resume saying, oh, they went here, there, et cetera. They're curating their education. They're learning what they need to do to figure out where they want to be. And by the time they get to you, hopefully you're that answer, and they might spend 1 or 7 or 17 years with you. Be happy and get all the value you can out of it and return it back into them. It's a value for value exchange. All right. So can you share a success story of a company or organization that's implemented some of the principles in the retention revolution that you've either witnessed or interviewed about, where you witnessed like a remarkable transformation in their workplace culture?
A couple of things come to mind. One of the things that I think about a lot is this idea of internal mobility and creating your own ecosystem for growth, because if you don't create it within your own organization, hands down, people are going to leave to go somewhere else. So, and this, there's a continuum. There could be a company that's small and they just create a little Excel spreadsheet of what people want to learn, combine with projects that are available, do a little matching, and give people this opportunity. It doesn't have to be so crazy or expensive, up through, big companies that are popping up now. Gloat,
LMS systems that are tracking everything. Yeah,
LMS system, and Gloat is one. It's almost like an internal LinkedIn to nudge people to say, hey, you know what? You say you're interested in this. Here are a couple of things. So I think depending on where you are on the continuum in terms of size and budget, the good news is that a lot of these things don't have to cost a lot, but I would push people to really think about this internal ecosystem. What comes with that, however, is this idea of change management, which I haven't written as much about. But if you can have all the best systems in the world, specifically, let's say on this idea with the LMS and getting people to move around. But if you have not trained your managers to not hoard talent, and there's not that sense of psychological safety to raise their hand and say, hey, you know what, I'm in this role, but I'd really love this. Like, that becomes a huge problem. And to your point about celebrating people, like, I would love at the end of, if I had a company right now with a lot of people, at the end of the year, I'd say, you know what, let's celebrate the managers who have the most people that moved around internally, because at least they're staying within our walls, and we know hands down that they're going to go somewhere else. In the book, I have Citigroup, their HR organization, that created the Experience Hub, which helps move people. And what's funny about that example is that, Citigroup, it's a huge company within their HR organization. They have to do this for everyone else, but they realized it was almost the shoemaker's children, that they hadn't really done it enough for themselves, and they did it. I also have a company in there called Real Chemistry, and this I also would love to look into a little bit more. I have 3 kids in college, and I kind of get jealous when I think about them having an internship. Why are internships only for young people? Like, why are we sort of pigeonholed? So I wonder aloud that, over time, if there are really creative ways to kind of move people around, and there is a company, Real Chemistry, that has this, I call it the internalship, almost like these internships for kind of later in life.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Hang on, Erica. We have to stop here. But coming up in the second part of my talk with Erica Keswin, the speaker, workplace strategist, and author of The Retention Revolution, we'll hear Erica's thoughts on how Generation Z is influencing and shaping today's workplaces.
When we think about Gen Z, they're coming in with a vengeance. And in a positive way, they have completely destigmatized talking about mental health at work. It is there. They're going to pick a job or not pick a job based on whether or not their wellness is taken into consideration.
This has been Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you want to empower your organization to reach new heights, go to johnwmitchell.com to find the techniques and tools you need to attract and retain the best team and boldly reimagine your workplace. Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell is a production of Forbes Books.